Welcome back to school, everyone. Maybe some of you are in classes. Good for you right now in summer sessions. I will be going over a pretty historical look at earthquakes in the interior. If you're a science buff, there'll be some science in here, but if you're a history buff, it's going to lean more on the history side. And I will, since we got a late start, I'll do my best to get it moving here. I also recognize some faces from the Science for Alaska talk. There's a couple slides that are kind of prerequisite here. I do have to start these kind of earthquake talks with plate tectonics. Why do earthquakes happen? This is a map of the world, earthquakes plotted as dots. I can kind of see where the continents are on here. The center set of dots is what's known as the Ring of Fire, where there are volcanoes and earthquakes all around the Pacific. Alaska is right here up at the top. We are right about at that dot. So the plates are moving around on the Earth, and at the boundaries, things get stuck, things slide, and they get released in earthquakes that have been happening for as long as we've had plate tectonics, which is controversial, but over 1 billion years. So we've had earthquakes for a long time on the planet. So these earthquakes define the plate boundaries on the planet. So where we have earthquakes in general show you kind of where these big plates are on the planet. Again, can't see much from this map, but if we look at the boundaries here, you have the San Andreas Fault in Southern California. You have this big arc offshore Alaska. Japan over here. When you think of earthquakes, you probably think of these kinds of places where people live and where there are large earthquakes. And Alaska is one of these places. We don't have as many stories. Why? Because we don't have as many people. And therefore, we also don't have as much funding for earthquake science, for example, as a place like Japan. But really, part of this is relevant for how the stories we capture. Do we have 2,000 years of a written record here in Alaska? No. Do they have that in Greece, in Japan? Yeah, they do. So the goal of getting historical earthquakes in Alaska, it's made a little easier by the fact that we've only got a century or so of that record. And we have other tools to go back further in time, but for now we'll be looking at that history. On these plates, they're moving with a certain speed, and these arrows kind of show how fast and in what direction they're going. So if we think of North America as fixed, we've got this huge plate, the entire Pacific Ocean, moving that way. And it's plunging under southern Alaska. And that's what gives us the biggest earthquakes like the 1964 earthquake. So I just told you about plate tectonics, and the rest of the talk is about interior Alaska, which doesn't exactly line up with what we think of plate tectonics, with everything happening on these boundaries. This kind of fuzzy looking map, this is Alaska right here, but this is the sort of main publication in 2003 about the plates of the world. And this hatch mark is basically saying, well, plate tectonics doesn't quite work in this region. And Alaska, you can see it covers almost all of Alaska. And what it's saying is that although plate tectonics explains most earthquakes, there are regions on the planet where stuff is deforming and crunching all over the place in a very broad region, in this case from offshore southern Alaska to the Brooks Range, and that's where we have earthquakes. So plate tectonics explains the basic features of earthquakes on the planet, but explaining why it's so spread out about here, that's kind of one of the mysteries, and that's frankly what makes a lot of things interesting in seismology. We don't really know where in Alaska the next earthquake will be. This is what a map of earthquakes in Alaska looks like. You can see there's kind of a rough line right here. These are colored by depth. So the ones that are red are deeper, and this is the Pacific Plate diving under Alaska. It is going underneath Alaska, right at about Nenana, 200 kilometers below us. There's a plate going down, and there are earthquakes in that plate. And the collision of this plate with Alaska is more or less responsible for all these other dots on the map. If you look at the scale, this is a magnitude 4 to 5 dot. This is a kind of earthquake, just for your reference. If this happened right here, you would be very scared. So when you look at that map, it's sort of a matter of where you are when these happen. Generally, we're far away from the action. But in terms of, if you look at what the rest of the United States or North America looks like, Alaska overwhelms the rest of the United States with earthquakes. I hope you're You already know that, but if you don't, we are earthquake country. We are #1 by a long shot. So that's interesting scientifically, because why those are happening, there's something to learn about how the Earth deforms and how it accommodates plate tectonics. So as I say, yes, interior Alaska is earthquake country. We're right here, right in the center of quite a bit of activity here. Okay, my talk is about interior Alaska. And so a lot of Alaska, people think 1964, big Aleutian earthquakes, tsunamis. This talk isn't about that. This is about the sort of lesser known stories, and hopefully if you're from this area and possibly you've been through some of these earthquakes, this is what the story is. Magnitude 5.8 and greater. So I'm going to sort of, this is what my talk's going to be about. Greater than magnitude 5.8. So what's a 5.8 earthquake? It's hard to, depends on where you are. If you're right on top of it, you won't stand on your feet. You'll be thrown to the ground. If you're a seismometer, anywhere on the planet, you will record that earthquake. So 5.8, 5.5, these are earthquakes that would be recorded everywhere on the planet, not just by modern instrumentation, but by basically instrumentation that was working about 1910, even 1900. 5.8 is pushing it for that technology, but the point is we've had earthquakes that are capable of recording very subtle ground motion for a long, long time. And that information helps tell us something about the earthquakes on this map. And in fact, all the dots on this map, and these are colored by magnitude. Blue is 5.5, 6, 6.5, and 7. So these red dots kind of, as you can imagine, if we look at a century of earthquakes in the interior, the bigger the earthquake, the bigger the news. And so we'll sort of focus on that. This is 1958 Huslia, an event that the late Neil Davis really had remarkable field work out there. This is 1904 on my Science for Alaska talk earlier this year. This is 1937 in Salcha. We have a 2002, which I presume a lot of people who are around felt that. 1947, 1912. These are the magnitude 7 earthquakes that have happened in the last century. 7 is pretty big. That's an alarming earthquake if you're close to that. If you felt Denali earthquake, you say, I felt a 7.9, but remember, you felt it, but you didn't really feel it. If you really felt it, you would be out at Pump Station 10 or on the Richardson Highway out there. So trying to impress on people, I felt a magnitude 7, it's kind of subjective. I mean, you could feel an earthquake in Anchorage in Fairbanks and the lights swaying. Yes, you felt a magnitude 7 at 800 kilometers away. It's not quite the same as being, having things fall all over the place. So this is what we're going to look at, and this gives you an idea. The dots are in a lot of places on this map. So here if we zoom in here, just to give you kind of better frame of reference, Fairbanks, I've plotted the roads here, McGrath, Ruby, Tanana, Huslia. This is what I'm calling kind of interior central Alaska for the sake of this talk. And all these dots are stories. And we'll see that every single one of these was felt. Every single one of them was mentioned in the news. And we're not going to go through all of them, don't worry. But we'll go through a lot of them. So I want to point out, if we go back and forth here, another takeaway here. See the arrows? Okay, the point here is an earthquake is not just a dot on a map. I'm talking about earthquakes that are big. And when we talk about large earthquakes, it's not, here's a point and waves go outward. This earthquake in 2002, in between Richardson Parks Highway, started on it's called a thrust fault, kicked into the Denali Fault, which you can see even in just topography maps, you can see where the Denali Fault runs. And it's 300 kilometers long. Meaning, so it's a thing that starts and it rips through Alaska, the tip just like kind of a jet plane breaking the sound barrier. It goes through Alaska, propagates all the way down. This is the Tochunda Fault. This is crossing the Richardson Highway where the pipeline was shut down and really almost narrowly averted a pretty major disaster. So here's the dot that represents that earthquake. It's red. But keep in mind, 7.9 earthquake, we're talking about a large, large space. So that's something that is not that obvious. It's hard to convey the size of an earthquake, but a line does a lot better than a dot. But this is 2002. We can say a lot about a 2002 earthquake. 1904, well, We know about how large it is, but we don't know much more. We don't know where it broke the ground like we would in 2002. Finally, these red lines show the mapped active faults in Alaska. The Denali Fault here, the Tintina Fault, the Kaltag Fault, the Iditarod-Nixon. There's other small faults in here. Here's a magnitude 7.3 in Huslia. So what's the deal? We have a lot of dots that aren't on faults. So, I mean, the idea that we should be guided by where did someone tell us there's a fault? Well, earthquakes, they're all happening on a fault, especially ones this size. We just can't see it at the surface. That doesn't mean it's less important, but this is kind of a challenge of deciding where to study and where to focus on efforts. As a seismologist, if a geologist says, hey, you know what, I don't see any fault out in Minto Flats, there's no fault. And in 1995, there's a magnitude 6 earthquake. If you were here in 1995, you might remember that. That occurred on a fault. Okay, there's no map, and it might have been deep down underground. There may be nothing to look at on the surface, but this is sort of to get at trying to understand when we look at a dot on the map, maybe it occurred on one of these faults, and maybe it's just on a fault that we really can't see at the surface, but it's still relevant for hazard. Any magnitude 7, we need to know when did it happen, where did it happen, how often does it happen, what kind of damage did it cause. On to the newspapers, and this is where I failed to mention really the key sponsors of this research, and I should go back to that. One is the National Science Foundation, one is the University of Alaska Fairbanks Geophysical Institute, and the other is the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. And they, they agreed to photograph the only existing hard copies of these newspapers. These have been photographed from microfilm, but you'll see some images that are spectacularly preserved forever, hopefully now, with the digital files. Eric Inman and Rod Boyce of the News Miner agreed. This is what the stacks look like sitting in a vault downtown. These have to be unbounded, peeled apart. They're over a century old. You can see 1912. You peel them apart, photograph them with a professional photographer. You can blow these up. And this is actually going to be the core part of a special exhibit that will be at the Museum of the North starting fall 2018. Plenty of time to get ready for that. But I do want to thank the News Miner because that's the content that forms the basis for this talk. So I'll be showing a lot of pages. And so what are we going to look for on these? We're going to look at newspapers. And what are we going to look for? As a scientist, there is some value in here. I think there's great outreach for conveying awareness about earthquakes. That's probably my main motivation. But there actually is some value scientifically because a lot of this information just hasn't been examined in terms of how strong things were shaking, what kind of damage did. So my points are, is the information scientifically valuable? I ask that, when I'm looking at it. Is the information accurate? So it's a newspaper. It is a primary source. It's not, you're not talking to the person. There could be an anecdote, secondhand, but it's about as primary as we're going to get for most of this information. You'll see we have, Wickersham's diary played a role. That's more of a primary source. We all know newspapers aren't the most accurate piece of information, and you'll see some funny examples of that. Is there a reference to the earthquake history of the interior? Is there a reference, in other words, I like the fact that you'll see every time there's a big earthquake in the interior, there's continuity. They say that was the biggest since 1937. And in 1937, that was the biggest since 1912. You can see, you don't have to have a seismic catalog. You can follow the newspapers, and they know that continuity. There's enough. It's not happening every 150 years. It's happening every 10 to 20 years. And that gives us kind of an interesting continuity that, yeah, we will have one in 10 to 20 years. It's just inevitable. You're not going to stop plate tectonics, and you're not going to stop earthquakes. How is the information reaching the newspaper? Wireless telegraph? Is it boat? I mean, now we Google it. It's there. Earthquake happened. You get it immediately. But when you look at the delay, how long it takes information to reach the source, it's kind of fascinating. In 1904, when they put in wireless telegraph, before that, what kind of news did they have? It was very local news, because there was zero information coming in from the outside, aside from a ship comes in, here's some news. But these things really transform what you see in the papers, and the photographer noted that as he looked at how today the newspaper is highly local news. And back, 50 years ago, it's all national news. It's the only source of information coming in. What are the main stories of the day? Just sort of getting at Vietnam, statehood, Amelia Earhart lost at sea. I mean, these stories for connecting with people about the time and the era, I hope you'll sort of see that as you go through them. So we're going to start in 1904. So I'll have a few slides. I gave a talk in January. I'll just show a couple examples where to try to convey, this was the boom time in the interior. A lot of the communities are founded by the gold rush. As things trickled out of Dawson down the Yukon, Fairbanks was a huge success and long-lasting. Nome was another big one, not as long-lasting, you could argue. This is Rampart in 1899. There were multiple newspapers in Rampart in 1899. When you sort of look at the riverfront here, photograph from that time, basically clear-cut logging everything to power the steamships. So in these areas, you just cut everything down because steamships, 45 steamships per day, up and down the Yukon, all that's being powered by wood. So here's the story from Yukon Valley News out of Rampart, and one of the big discoveries from this was a new discovery from the newspapers, just identifying this earthquake that happened to be far away, but they said 2nd Avenue, buildings swayed and cracked, inmates ran out in alarm. In some instances, the shock was not even felt by people on the sidewalk. It continued slightly less than a minute and was most violent just after its beginning and before its close. So we have an account of an earthquake, and that turns out to be a magnitude 7.3 earthquake, pretty far away, but we have this pretty nice record that was unbeknownst to the scientific literature about the shaking from that. So that was from Rampart. And there was another newspaper out of Nome. Nome had, I believe, 3 newspapers at this time. One of them had just received wireless telegraph from St. Michael on the western coast of Alaska. And this was actually the second story they ever received after wireless telegraph. The first was a boxing fight that covered most of the front page. You wouldn't guess it by the way I've sort of blown this up here. But on the front page, there was this earthquake reported from St. Michael, which, if you sort of have a map of Alaska in your head, is very far from Rampart, it's far from Fairbanks. And so here was this severe earthquake at St. Michael. Just read it. This place was visited by a severe earthquake at 10:55 Saturday morning, lasting for more than 5 minutes. Everything was violently disturbed while the shocks lasted, and a number of people were made seasick from the movements of the ground. Beyond the fear engendered in the hearts of everyone here, there was no damage done. So seasick is not an uncommon report for this sort of long distance, and that actually does mean what it sounds like. You're either seasick or you're throwing up from the motion. So there's a second, 1904, so that's digging way back. That's at the height of the gold rush, where we had newspapers in places where you may not ever imagine. If you visited St. Michael or Rampart, you have to picture in your head there are loggers, bars, and people with probably either too much wealth or none at all roaming around, and a ratio of 19:1 men to women. So that's a little different too. This was Wickersham's diary, so famous sort of founder of both the university, the statewide system, federal judge, mountaineer, pretty impressive guy. And so this was his diary entry from Fairbanks. Same earthquake, 1904. Earthquake at 12 o'clock noon, quite strong for several minutes. No damage, but everybody ran outdoors, busy closing up court matters, and nothing left that I can force to be finished. So there's this is an account that gives us an idea this earthquake was felt in Fairbanks. And I just show a couple photos. This is 1 month before the earthquake, and in Fairbanks showing a gathering, 4th of July gathering, Wickersham. This is Wickersham right here, very formal affairs, showing this from another angle. Here's someone playing violin. The women are dressed in fine clothes and hats. This kind of gives you a broader picture. So this is Fairbanks in 1904. Really spectacular preservation of this time, and also sort of tying this to Wickersham, who is the only written anything recorded from this time. Wickersham dutifully kept a diary, And written records during the gold rush was not something of a whole lot of value to people. So we're left with very little information of any kind written down. From the same day, this is looking toward First Avenue from sort of where the Catholic Church is there. And this is these are the bars, and these are people, probably a parade, a combination of celebrating at the bars or the saloons, but that gives you some idea of what this life was. And this was the title slide from the same month of the earthquake, but just giving you an idea of what this time is like. The newspapers are interesting, but the photographs, which are not in the newspapers for the most part until the 30s, we don't have them. So these images are incredible. So here's the earthquake. It was felt in Coldfoot, Sunrise, in Kenai Peninsula, Fairbanks, Rampart. This gives you an idea of how much of Alaska felt this earthquake. That gives you some idea when you talk about how big an earthquake is. The extent of shaking is one measurement of that. And that is that is a widely felt, these distances in here are big, and it's also consistent with what we know from that earthquake, which is sort of 7.3 magnitude. If we look at 1904 and we zoom to 2002, they're still using this kind of technology to get an idea. You can now go online and enter a few questions to get an idea of what it'll give you a number based on your shaking intensity. These Roman numerals, this is for the Denali Fault earthquake. So this is kind of Alaska, Yukon. And you see that this shaking intensity is 8 to 9 right in the center here. And these numbers are all reports of people, whether they felt it or not. But you can see that this earthquake was felt in Seattle. There was water wells disturbed in Oklahoma. This is a huge earthquake, one of the biggest, in fact, the biggest strike slip earthquake really of the modern instrumental era. All right, we're going to go back to, we're at 1904, and we're now going to 1912. 1912, I said it's about earthquakes, but the stories are equally interesting. I'm going to throw in the largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. That occurred in southern Alaska, Valley of 10,000 Smokes. This is Katmai Nova Rupta. And this is an interesting one because this is the June 8th front page news. I'm going to credit a student at Geophysical Institute Design Services. What she's done, she went through all the news and we colored it by either local news is red, national news is green, state news is blue, and all the unshaded stuff is the earthquake story. So here's the front page from June 8th, 1912. We have this little story here, eruptions alarm people of coast. Heavy, I don't even know this word, cannonading. Heavy cannonading and the fall of volcanic ash is supposed to be the result of inlet country. The cannonading started at 7 o'clock, and at 2 o'clock, heavy blasts were heard following each other. The detonations are rolling down from the mountainous country to the west. So that's the story as they have it here on the 8th coming in from Cordova. We'll just go through this here. 2 days later, we still have earthquakes in our coast camps. Volcanoes were heard plainly. I know you can't read these, so I'm going to but I'm conveying you where the news is. It's front page news, and that's sort of part of the point of the talk, but we'll zoom in on some of these to see what this is about. Earthquakes in our coast camps. Mayor Gilmore and the other passengers on the Dora, so that's the name of the ship, passed through the Inferno. Was a terrifying sight. The ship was basically right underneath, in between Kodiak and the volcano, and which was, as I say, they survived, but it would have been rained down on ash. And as I say, the largest eruption aside from Krakatoa in the 19th century, this is the biggest one in the 20th century. So numerous shocks of earthquakes were registered Saturday. So you have a combination of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The whole Kenai Peninsula was shaken by deafening explosions. I won't go through this. The passengers on the Dora arrived here, passing through the scenes of the upheaval of the various mountains, and say that the sight in the volcanic zone was terrifying, rivaling all imaginative conceptions of Dante's Inferno. So never to embellish a newspaper, but you can go. This is, to give you an idea, that's the Dora. So that's the ship. They're the pretty famous ship from southern Alaska, but that's the ship they're on. witnessing basically ash raining out. Kodiak was buried in over 2 feet of ash, which is fairly far away, but there's some terrific stories. So here we are in the interior. That's where the newspaper is being written, in Fairbanks. And here we have, they heard them. So imagine that. You hear the volcanic eruption at hundreds of miles away. Really, of course, several persons thought they were road crews blasting, were much mystified, roadhouse men at a loss to account for volcanoes cannonading. And anyway, so this story is about how they're piecing it together, right? They're like, yeah, we heard that blasting too, but the stories haven't come in because you either have to have a boat come around. Probably they have some telegraph, though, the sort of most connected the telegraph was probably when they built it in like 1904 and 5. But it's clear that the stories are not coming in that fast as you look on. And then, same day, volcanic ash falls. So here we are in the interior, and ash is falling out from an eruption that nobody can really see. But now they're really piecing it together. Here it says, the most interesting thing in the way of natural phenomenon seen here is that volcanic ash is falling thickly today. Looking against a dark background, the air appears to be full of mist, while the white dust soon collects thickly on black hats or boards left in a quiet spot. So this is way far away. This is not, they refer to the same manner as Krakatoa eruption in 1883, responsible for red sunsets. So here, this isn't preposterous. This happened, 100 years ago. We had a big eruption. So, I think it would be pretty shocking to see this, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. It's probably happened before that. We just didn't have these kinds of accounts. Here's a map of the ash fall. So Seattle, depends on which way the wind's blowing. A lot of research here at the university is for aviation. So tons of flights per day go right over this, the sort of shortest path to Europe, are coming over these regions. So there's constant monitoring of winds and eruptions going on. Bogoslav is the one you may have heard in the news. But this shows this is a pretty large coverage of ash. And so that boat was right here when the eruption happened. This is Kodiak getting something like 2 feet of ash after it's compacted. Okay, so go through this one. Here's the news. This is 3 days later now. The story's still rolling in. Alaska towns buried in volcanic ashes, Kodiak and Woody villages destroyed. We'll see whether that really turned out to be the case. And then we see these stories, which for 1912, I was saying, what's important in 1912? What's important is how high the river is. Is the river high or low? Because that's where your information's coming in. That's where your supplies are coming in. That's your way out of town. If you're lucky enough to get out of here in the winter, the last boat out, it all depends on how high the river is. So you'll often see these stories, water high up the Chena. At first I saw that, who cares, water high up the Chena? But I mean, it's all about, stuff coming in and out. There's no railroad in town. There's no road, at least, this is the main stuff's coming up, the Yukon, Tanana, Chena. So that's how stuff's getting in and out. Water high up the Chena. Here's a story about, how do people get up and down the rivers? Here's a story about a man poling up to Chena Hot Springs. Imagine that, just get in a boat, start poling. Not paddling, just poling. So pulled up Chena Hot Springs, water high up the Chena, now it's falling again. Volcanic eruptions distinctly heard at the hot springs. So this story combines kind of a passenger polling the water level, but then also talking about just they're piecing it together that really everyone heard these earthquakes. Here's a story, same page, ash falling at Tolovana right under that story. This was really cool to me because in 2015 I talked to a guy, Paul Isau in Nenana, and he wasn't around in 1912, but we were talking about earthquakes from 1937 and 47. He had some remarkable stories, but in the middle of the conversation, he said, yeah, but my mom talked about the real big one that blanketed our place in ash out in Tolovana. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing story. And then as we're going through the newspaper, ash is falling at Tolovana. So this guy's story is, he lives at Tolovana. If you've been down the Tanana, there isn't anything there. There's a roadhouse, and he lived sort of a couple miles up. So it was neat to see this story you know, just to corroborate what he said about it, even though he wasn't there. The fact that his mom had told him this story was pretty cool. So as the story goes on, we've got next day, 200 dead on the Alaskan coast, native population of 7 villages exterminated. Latest reports from the volcanic zone are worse than those which have been to the loss of property and now added the loss of life, which is irrecoverable. Don't get too sad. It didn't really happen. So now there's a story as time goes on. Reports scout loss of life. They're thinking, well, let's. And then it's like, well, a few days later, still on the front page. So they're saying, well, hey, that's pretty much it. Not so bad as first reported. So in fact, nobody, I think 2 people died, but it wasn't even clear that it was from the eruption. Number of dead as a result of the Alaska volcanic eruptions is 100% less than was reported. So, but you know, credit to correcting the story. It's not buried in a footnote. It's on the front page. We could probably learn from that even now. But you know, you have to be cautious if you're reading this and trying to infer something. This is still in Katmai. This is fascinating. This is now something like 15 days later, and here this red means all local news. So this is kind of the local news page 3 or so. And then here you have sulfur and air rusted tools. They finally pieced together the acid rain from raining through all this ash just destroyed all the mining equipment. And you know, this is just, if I had to sort of write down, guess what happened when ash fell in the interior, I wouldn't have come up with this. I mean, it seems, yeah, that could happen, tons of metal. But imagine you've just invested in pulling up some metal machinery from the lower 48 up the Yukon, the Tanana, and you've got it out and ready to go in June, fire it up, and you get the biggest volcanic eruption and then acid rain, and you're done. So, but I mean, these are just the kind of stories, you know, if we have our volcanic eruption today, we're not going to have this story. We'll have some other stories, but not that one. On that same page, if you're from Fairbanks, this is a terrific piece. Even in 1912, this was a big deal. The longest running baseball game, I think, in the U.S. Game's been going on forever, but even, you know, no one can rightly call himself a sourdough until he has witnessed this famous sporting feature. Tonight's contest between the Eagles and Van Dyck starts at 11 p.m. So the Midnight Sun baseball game. How many of you have been to a Gold Panter Midnight Sun game? We got probably half of you. Baseball's long, but that game's, yeah, it's worth once. On to the earthquakes. 1912 earthquake in Denali. This is the Fairbanks Sunday Times. There is no record of the Daily News Miner from July. We have the beautiful coverage from the Katmai from the previous month, but we don't have any record at all from here. So this is a competing newspaper, but still have 1912 earthquake that happened somewhere on the Denali Fault. And this says, Fairbanks rocked by severe earthquake. The man was killed by a slab falling on him. This is the story. Most violent disturbance recorded in the interior. Startles residents at their homes at 10 o'clock. First shock lasted more than a minute and was followed by a second less severe tremor 5 minutes later. No damage results. I guess except for the dome, the slab falling on the man. But in here, that story is, again, this is far away, but it's still front page news. That kind of story definitely gets passed forward in time. Here's a little bit of the story. I won't go through it. Just describes in pretty good detail about what places shake. Chattanooga, Olney, Esther, all the gold places, you know, are the big communities. McLean store dishes were tumbled down. Stovepipe was shaken. A man sleeping was spilled onto the floor. Fortunately, there was no fire in the stove. Had there been, the results probably would have been disastrous. At the time the shock occurred, the telegraph offices were closed. It was impossible to hear from the coast. Some are inclined to believe that Mount Katmai, again, is in eruption, and the darkened sky in that direction lends color to the belief. That turns out to be totally wrong, but I mean, you had this crazy volcanic eruption, and now you have a big earthquake. You know, it's speculation, but you know, this is the kind of thing that you can see that at least the continuity of these stories is you know, easy to see in the paper. And in this case, someone was working at this time, I guess 10 p.m. or something, and died under the slab. In general, we have, you know, there are very few deaths in any of these stories just by virtue of very few people close to this shaking. We're not If we want to talk about destruction, you can take a much, much smaller earthquake in Iran, for example, kills 30,000 people. So these are, I'm not going into that, but in general, we don't have, there are very few stories like that. A few days later, what's interesting about this story, if you know anything about the sort of history of Denali, the mountaineering, Parker Brown expedition was Herschel Parker and Belmore Brown at the time of this earthquake had just come off a failed attempt, almost got to the top within, I think, 500 feet of the summit, and witnessed a heck of an earthquake right on the Denali Fault, moved boulders that were 250 pounds in their camp, and they watched the entire Alaska Range avalanche, which ended up being a problem the following year for Hudson Stuck and Company, because they were taking photographs that this expedition had taken, and they got up on the mountain and they said, this doesn't look anything like what's in the picture. And they actually pieced it together at that time. You can read in their account, they said earthquake. That they pieced it together that the entire route that they were following had avalanched in ice and rock and, well, couldn't go up that route. So it's a neat connection with the earthquake because it's actually a very detailed account. Blizzards prevent noted climber from reaching summit of Alaska's Big Mountain, ascended South Peak to altitude of 20,200 feet, but were driven back by storms. Severe earthquake, July 6th, shook the mountain. And this story's Professor Parker states that the mountain was violently shaken by an earthquake. Fortunately for the members of the party, they had reached Clearwater River tributary when the shock came. No injuries resulted, although the severity of the quake threw them from their feet and upset everything loose in the vicinity. Huge boulders were rolled around like marbles, and even flat rocks were overturned as if made of wood. The party had just completed the descent when the shock came, and the loud reports which thundered down to them from the mountain indicated great disturbances in the high altitudes. The professor is of the opinion that they might not have escaped with their lives had the shock come while they were on the mountain. That's an understatement. I mean, yeah. They watched a huge, and the scope of the avalanches were caught up in that. I mean, they could have missed it, but that's a interesting statement. Not much happens. 1929 in Healy. This isn't even front page news, but it starts with a series of earthquakes whose violence has not been equaled since the summer of 1912. It says when Mount Katmai erupted, but I think they're getting a little confused. There's Katmai, but there was also this earthquake in 1912. It's easy to imagine someone saying, yeah, there was the ash and there was these earthquakes, because Katmai also had earthquakes. In the middle of this story, in Nenana, the population is said to have turned out almost en masse as buildings began to rock violently. And in Fairbanks also there were many who made their way to the streets and waited for the Earth's movement to subside. So when you read that, if you said, is the earthquake closer to Nenana or Fairbanks? I mean, you start by saying probably Nenana. I mean, as it turns out, this earthquake was sort of in the Healy region. But even within these stories, you can kind of check. There's a lot of uncertainty when we use instrumental data to try to figure out where these earthquakes happen. So it's good to have eyewitness accounts describing something to, in some cases, if it's reliable, like Wickersham's diary, you can potentially rule out what you might otherwise conclude, or it can at least reduce your uncertainty in this. Okay, black slide. Okay, 1937. This is kind of one of the big stories. 1937 was in Salcha, so a lot of coverage in Fairbanks. This was a 7.3 earthquake, the biggest close earthquake we've ever had. So this is, I wouldn't call it the big one, because that would probably be, you probably want to reserve that for something in Fairbanks. But here is Fairbanks hit by its worst quake. This is the story of Amelia Earhart lost at sea. Faith is put in the island. So this is the national news, local news, flu rages at Hooper. And then this story is all about the landslide broke the Richardson Highway landslide. Salcha Bluffs just covered the road. There were cracks in the road. $5,000 done to stores. Basically all the liquor stores had the most damage, and that seems to be a theme for quite some time. And so there's science in here. So by 1937 we had a seismometer in 1935 here, which is very early. So it's kind of a nice connection with the history of seismology, that the university was in the action that early on, and was measuring that. So you start getting actual scientists writing some of these stories in there, and you'll even see some photos. There's just some neat stuff. This is page 2. Here's a cutout. You cut out a map of Fairbanks and you send it to people. Every time you write a letter, you know, boost your own hometown with the good-natured, a pictorial map of Fairbanks. So, I mean, these are just kinds of things you don't see in the paper, but when you think about, as you go through here, you'd probably enjoy sort of looking at some of this. Even, so this is in the local news, the Empress Theater, which is still, you know, that's on 3rd Avenue downtown. Here's an ad in here. I forget, I don't think I zoomed in on this one, and unfortunately, but it's a pretty hilarious ad about a store getting all its good thrown out, but telling people to please come back and purchase things. So this is page 4 of the same day. Random shouts home about earthquake, first shock, slide at mile 31. If you have a magnitude 7 in Salcha, this is giving you some idea, it's going to dominate the news for many, many days. And that's what we see here. And that's, you know, an easy way to imagine, well, how big is that story? Is it deep in the news? This is occupying the news for many days. A story comes in. Why? Well, you keep having earthquakes. You have a magnitude 7, you have aftershocks. You just have more and more to go on. So here, late tremors light. The national news, China crisis tense again. So again, 1937, no damages or injuries. Epicenter puts a shock 45 miles from Fairbanks. Here's a good one I didn't fail to point out. Earthquake insurance, Alaska Insurance Agency, call John Butrovich Jr. So the University of Alaska statewide building is named after Butrovich. So very entrepreneurial. Going into the earthquake insurance business right after the earthquake, I'm sure. But that's kind of a fun connection. Here's one of the earliest photographs you see in the newspapers, so that was neat. I'll show, this is great story. You kind of see the scope of the news, state news, national news, earthquake news. Fairbanks put on the state's airline. That's a huge story. In fact, the story is that Seattle is getting bypassed for this. I forget what the full route is, but that didn't turn out to be the case, but this story, the big headline is about the state's airline, and these are photographs from the Richardson Highway of over 100 major and minor tremors recorded. This is what those, and again, if you look on the microfilm, this is black if you look in the sort of library archives. So the News Miner has one copy of this, and so you're able to see, you know, what this looked like to people. So this is an example of really the value of the high-quality photographs from the originals, just showing you some cracks in the road. And we don't just have those photographs, but in archives, there's a few photographs out of it says blockade caused by the earthquake, July 22nd. Here's some folks dressed pretty nice. You know, they can afford an automobile. They're probably pretty well-to-do. And here they are looking around. And in case you sort of can't tell the scale of the size of the cracks, why not just put your child in there for scale? I mean, as I zoom in, it's sort of a smile. It's like, but yeah, I don't know. What's that?
That's John Butrovich.
That's John Butrovich. Well, I did not know that. Well, I got to follow up with that. This is a couple days later, just stories. I mean, Japs quit fishing. I mean, there's sort of the language, you know, Bristol Bay fishing abandoned by Orientals. I didn't know that was, I didn't know that Japanese were fishing out in that area, but the language is different, put it that way. And so here you sort of see Pavlov, there's some earthquake story dying out, and then finally there's a few, you know, few more quakes registered here. Earthquakes continue to be felt in this vicinity, so that story's come to an end. Onward to 1947. This is now sharpest, again, Fairbanks survey, minor damage in wake of interior Alaska's sharpest quake in 10 years. This is a 7.3 earthquake near Healy, but strongly felt in Fairbanks. I think the damage is, again, mainly, you know, alcohol-related wares. But you can sort of, yeah, you see the stories change, the style of the paper changes. If you look at if you look in the bottom right down here, this is what it says. Giving no solace to the situation last night was a recurring rumor that a big quake bigger than any previous was scheduled for 10 o'clock. And in spite of assurances from Saint Amand, who's the UAF person, that the earthquakes could not be forecast, the rumor continued to make the rounds until after the clock had passed that hour. So there is tons of stuff that like this in there, you know, that's a true story. I mean, it's not to say it wasn't, it probably was a big deal. I mean, there isn't, I mean, even now, these rumors can persist. We like to think that we would know better, but maybe if you're in the bar at 10 o'clock, it'd feel different. So this shows kind of what the scale of that kind of earthquake. You can take all the shaking in 1947, you can put a number on that. There's a bunch of text in here, but the earthquakes in here, there's a lot of shaking. Scientists can make maps of this shaking. I want to go in to sort of explain a little more about, I mentioned people who I talked to about some of these earthquakes. This shows the numbers, how strong the shaking is based on some reports. So this is kind of scientific data that the seismologists would go out and ask people, collect information, and try to ascertain where the earthquake was. They're not, you know, nowadays we could, at the moment, there's all data comes in everywhere on the globe right away. We have access at our fingertips to all that data. Back in 1947, that could take weeks to find that data. So the fastest way is to go, who shook the strongest? You know, what happened in Nenana? What happened in McKinley Park? And so they're actually trying to get that information directly from these shaking reports. And so these contours show where they think the sort of shaking intensity was strongest. This is the epicenter derived from global seismic data. So the fact that this is, you know, that they're in rough agreement is encouraging. Now we know that this is going to be a pretty reliable estimate, and some of the variability in the shaking is just due to the reports or due to the location where they are. I wanted to throw in a few more. If you go back, I spoke with a few folks in Minto and Nenana, and it's really cool because these people were here, 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 and here during that earthquake. So no one talked to them, obviously, in sort of compiling the data, but these are also fascinating places in Minto Flats. There's a huge sedimentary basin where the shaking is much stronger, and so we have, you can go on YouTube, actually, if you go to my website, there are short recordings of people who experienced these earthquakes back in late Bergman Silas. From Minto, Sarah Silas, they're actually married for 70 years. I just have to add that because I hadn't met anyone that had been married for 70 years. Geraldine Charlie also passed away. And then from Nenana, Paul Esau, Caroline and Hank Ketzler, they all just talked about the earthquake. The story wasn't a major part of their life, but they could tell you exactly what happened. You don't experience many magnitude 7s. You know, Geraldine Charlie was weighing potatoes in Old Minto on a scale and described the scale going like this, which is what an earthquake does. It acts like an oscillator. So if you're holding on to a scale, well, yeah, you won't get the right weight on the potatoes. That's for sure. Okay, it's already 8. I know I got a late start. I'll try to blast through the recent part, but this is the 50th anniversary of the biggest earthquake, the most notable one that has hit Fairbanks. It was shakiest in 30 years. Again, what are we pointing back to? 67? It's pointing back to 1937. There's this sort of always continuity. And here you see photographs, stuff, glass windows blasted out. Here's a scientist looking intently at the seismic record. All of this, there's tons of news from this. And this will kind of be the centerpiece of the museum content because there's so much good photographs and stories. And really, this is what we have to be concerned about. This is a 5.7 earthquake. So, I mean, if you ratchet that up to a 7, you're going to have a really striking different story here. I'm not trying to scare anyone, but that's just the reality that these don't happen very often. This is a 5.7. We know very little about what fault this came from. So if that fault's capable of a large earthquake, the damage, of course, would be much more. We also have more people, more infrastructure. No shake like this since the 1937 tremor. There's, you know, state building hit by water break. There's there's real damage from this earthquake, shop windows. As I said, these actual images that I have are at the level where you can read the text very well beyond the pixels of this projector and everything. But I believe it was early in the morning, the first one, but then there were four earthquakes in a row. So there's a lot of, but yeah, I'm waiting for someone here to talk about this. There may be some potential people who are around. Okay, so next day, Fairbanks wakes up to new earthquakes. There's just basically, this is also this A67 schedule. This is the centennial of the Russia Purchase. So here, one of the talks in this series is the 150th anniversary of that. So here was this, jet fighters every day during, this is June 22nd on the solstice. Every day I kept seeing the schedule. I'm like, what's A67? What is, but obviously, yeah, so this is a celebration of 100 years, and it's kind of neat to see that. Here you have the seismologist's one moment of the century, a double-page photo spread of, pages 4 and 5, and there's just tons of shots of damage, science, all these, there's sort of chimneys tipped over. So this is just yeah, a nice show of what the photos can. This is a couple days later, new earthquakes. This is, I guess, what scientists looked like back then. They looked professional, but you got the same. You've got Vietnam stories. So when you look at these, it's hard not, my eyes, even with the earthquake stories, I'm drawn to the other stories on these pages, showing crack in the wall, kids looking up at jet fighters. There's something on U.S. jets hit Hanoi. Veteran of Anchorage earthquake assesses new temblors. We still have some aftershocks. Lyndon Johnson in here. Tremor activity on the decline. So there's sort of a tapering of the news cycle. A few more stories in here about someone denies predictions, some fortune teller who made the front page. You can always predict an earthquake when there's a big one. You're going to get it. That's called Omori's law. You have aftershocks. So here, as you're starting to get some scientific data looking at the decay and the number of earthquakes as a function of time. So there's kind of more science as we know a little more. This is one of my personal favorites because, again, this is a shot from the seismology lab at the university, and so I'm trying to imagine, would I be one of these people? But it's a different scene, a little more. I guess they're just relaxed in that outfit. So as we go in 67, late quakes, we're going to have to go on here. Fast forward 30 years. And that's why people, you can forget a lot in 30 years. I mean, what's the residence time of a family living in Fairbanks? So who was around in 1995 in Fairbanks? A lot of you, that's yeah. So you might remember this. This is a pretty strong shake. Murphy Dome, 3 miles from Murphy Dome out in Minto Flats. That's the kind of, I'm interested in this particular fault that came from. 2002, this is 7.9. You can see, at least read the headlines, shake, rattle, and roll. This is at least the professor claimed that this was caused by the earthquake. Probably, but yeah, probably the shelf at least. He kind of knocked over the, no. Earthquake felt in New Orleans. Pipeline withstands shakedown. I mean, those are headlines. We got the pipeline getting shut down. You got massive offset cracks in the road, and well, the top floor of GI. They painted over the cracks in the building. I wish they'd just kind of not done that. And so I only showed that there's some, I should have thrown in a picture of the pipeline and the sort of damage there, but this is just from Minto 2014 showing a slide with, this is just a magnitude 5, but a couple years ago, so people who were here a couple years ago in the fall, this is showing an image from the earthquake center pointing this out. Fault near Minto capable of much bigger earthquakes, expert says, and these is actually showing some seismogram wiggles there on the cover. But that's a kind of earthquake. That one is in the same as the one in 1995. That was from 7 p.m. Saturday. So I'll wrap up here. Closing remarks. Earthquakes are a part of history in Central Alaska. They will always be a part of really our story here. We seem to have a big one every 10 to 20 years. These earthquakes can be used to identify seismically active faults. So if I want to ask the question, what is the likelihood of ground motion right here exceeding, a certain level of acceleration in the next 50 years? You need to know the all possible candidates of what could contribute to that kind of ground motion or statement. And so this is where this is important to know. Just because a region looks seismically quiet today does not mean it was quiet in the past or will be in the future. So we can't just look at a map and say, this place is quiet. And there's some terrific examples of that from the Pacific Northwest and here. So thanks very much for your attention.